I'm Joanna Doven. This is On Crisis, bringing together PR experts, thought leaders, creatives, and CEOs here to start conversations and connect people with real-life stories in crisis communications. I'm really excited about this podcast taping with Jeff Hahn, who runs Hahn Public based in Austin, Texas, and owns 3 other agencies that feed into it. His focus is squarely in crisis communications, and he's worked with some of the world's top corporations in food and beverage and in energy and environment. And this is a real substantive conversation. We talk about Jeff's new book, How to Break Bad News, great title, and really dig into what the biggest problems are for leaders when they are faced with a crisis. Hint, hint, we have to lose that ego, and we have to realize that crisis communications is strategic, and there are matrices and paradigms for how to do it right. We have to combine the qualitative skill of speaking like a human and being emotional and relating to your audience with quantitative facts and data. And this podcast, for me, is something that I'm sending to my entire network and any leaders that I've ever worked with. Everyone should listen to it, because it just cuts to the chase of what you have to do now in order to prepare for the crisis. And one thing I want to leave you guys with before we start is you have 2 hours. That's it. You have 2 hours to get your message out before the virality and social media digital pitchforks come after you. Listen in. So happy to have Jeff Hahn on the On Crisis podcast today. Jeff and I go way back. When he was doing some consulting work for marathons on crisis, on how to handle crisis. I think this was after the Boston Marathon bombing. And I was working, of course, with the Pittsburgh Marathon, and Jeff came to town. And it's funny. So our mutual friend, Patrice Matamoros, she really understands people. She's a good people person. I mean, and she said to me, you have to meet Jeff. You're going to love Jeff. And of course, we hit it off right away, but we live in different cities, Austin and Pittsburgh. It's funny. I almost ended up in Austin, and I was just talking with somebody that said the city is completely open. It's happening there. There's a bunch of live music, and I'm thinking, oh, I need that right now. But we rejoined forces today on the podcast because Jeff launched a new book called Breaking Bad News, which is the best title because it's so pithy, right? It's just right on point. And I want to talk about that with you today, Jeff. Welcome.
Great to see you, Joanna. Yeah, and our days in Pittsburgh were not without crisis themselves. So it's nice to rejoin you in the conversation. And we might even go back to some of those marathon days and pull them into the conversation that we're going to have today.
Let's do it. Okay. So you've had a trajectory in the communication space that, really dated back to, being a child when your family home, you were uprooted because of a tornado, right?
That's right. Yeah. 1975, a tornado just destroyed our family farm.
Wow. And so looking back on that time, because I know a lot of people, myself included, over the past 2 years, I think we've had more time on our hands to because the world just slowed down, right? Yeah, you still might have business. I still am mothering my children, and that's nonstop, but I don't have to run to meetings like I used to, although that's starting to pick up. So the world slowed down, and there's more introspective thinking of, okay, how did I end up where I am now? Am I in the right space? How do you think that your childhood experiences have shaped your career path?
I think they've given me a philosophy on, especially professionally, of when a door closes, start looking for windows. Mm-hmm. And doors have closed on my career multiple times. I, of course, grew up thinking I was going to be a farmer. Mm-hmm. And that would have been an amazing life. And I would have loved that so much, but that wasn't my destiny. That door closed. It taught me that you got to start looking for windows. And even now I use that in difficult choices. If mm-hmm. I'm given a choice between door number 1 and door number 2, I'm looking for a window. it's always been, or it's become now ingrained in me to where I feel like it's always been there. But no, it was a learned skill that was brought on by forces outside of my control. Mm-hmm. Adapting to those forces and figuring out ways to take the next step forward, even in the aftermath of difficult situations, has become part of the philosophy. And it sort of influences the philosophy inside of Breaking Bad News that says, even in a difficult crisis situation, there is a way to move forward.
Love it. And what I believe to be true, and I've dealt with this in my personal life, unfortunately, recently, and then, in working with clients, is anytime there's a crisis, guess what? There's an opportunity, right? There's an opportunity there. And it's really, we almost, as crisis comms practitioners, or whatever you want to call us, a lot of our job becomes almost playing psychiatrist or therapist and getting the client to see that window. That can be very difficult sometimes. Sometimes it's not. I can tell you, I recently worked with a university who was dealing with I'll do a case study on this one day, but I can't now. Dealing with a crisis related to the Black Lives Matter movement, and somebody, quite frankly, fanning the flames on a particular issue that they were looking to personally benefit from. And truth did not matter, right? It was just, let's take advantage of this moment. There's one person trying to do it. And the media didn't want to cover the truth. And we can get into that. They covered a little bit of it, but, and I talk to media people about this and local news, because I still think the heart of news is always going to be local news. And, there is a change in newsrooms lately, and so many, I can ramble on about that. But in this particular case, it was hard for me to connect with the leader of this institution that here's the path we need to take now. We have to do it fast, right? What's your perspective on that?
For sure. The media has changed substantially. The essence of media coverage these days is in confrontation. Cover the confrontation and exploit that confrontation in the headlines. That's the clickbaitiness of today's media. In the situation that you talk about too, one other really important component that is at the heart of my thinking on crisis communication is speed. If you are not ready to respond quickly to control narrative, you will lose narrative. And you're going to become a punchline in a crisis story, probably a 50-50 shot if you're the victim or the villain.
Right. It doesn't matter what side you're on. Okay. So first, to that point, so the essence of news is to cover the confrontation and get the clickbait headline. Hasn't that always been the case? Or do you think that is more the case in 2021?
I think it has been the long running orientation of media. You can go back into the early 1900s in the age of yellow press and understand that's been a role that they have played. In this age, though, the differentiation amongst channels through social media and now in electronic platforms just accelerates the entire process and creates virality that didn't exist in even 20 years ago. So it is different.
Which is why speed matters, right?
Oh my gosh, yes, absolutely.
And so, okay, speed is different to some people. Like for me, speed, and for you, because this is what we do, speed is now. For some people, it could be, let me talk with my board, let me get approval on this, let me think about it. How do you counsel, and in your book, how do you talk about speed? When there's so let's give me a case study that you've worked on relative to speed and the importance.
The short answer is you have 2 hours. You have 2 hours when bad news breaks in order to respond and respond well. That's the model that is at the center of Breaking Bad News. There are only 5 steps you need to take inside of that 2 hour, what I refer to as the TikTok box. But inside that TikTok box, if you fail to move through the 5 decisions, you will lose the narrative. And that is something that I studied, researched pretty well and thoroughly in order to understand really what is the nature of the current news cycle. That's it. You got 2 hours. If you decide that you need to go talk to your board, if you decide you want to think about it for a few days or weeks, okay, here's the risks that you are now opening yourself and your brand to.
Yeah.
And that's really one of the more important things, is that decision makers in these situations take them very personally. This is about me, someone attacking me.
Oh, God.
No, their responsibility is to protect the brand.
Mm-hmm.
And they can do that simply by being a little bit more objective. And let's take your example. A protester lodges a complaint against a university. University presidents take that super personally. And they dig in, they go up into their ivory tower. I have a university client. They literally have a tower that they sit in.
It's not that far. I mean, the visualization is the reality there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I often counsel them. I said, this isn't an attack against you. So why don't you, with some objectivity, turn shoulder to shoulder with that person and start asking questions? Oh, this is the allegation that you've made. How did you get there? And make that interrogative a public event. What kinds of things are you experiencing? Why would you say those things about this university? Let the person who's being charged with or being talked about turn and ask the questions in public that everyone else is asking. It's a simple technique, but it requires depersonalization. And that's the thing that is so hard for leaders to apply, because inside of any crisis event is this situation called dissonance, psychological dissonance.
Oh, yes.
Where they're honestly not able to make that kind of objective decision.
Yes, I see that. And also they think saying nothing or waiting, they equate that to mitigating risk. Right.
Sure enough. And there is that's an orientation that comes often from legal counsel.
Oh gosh.
There is we'll talk more about that, because legal counsel will immediately default to a litigious situation and has the responsibility to limit liability. You limit liability best by not saying a word in order to have your day in court. What that dismisses or completely overlooks is the court of public opinion and the loss of reputation and the value of that. And so that orientation of no comment is a fixture that honestly, every 20th time that I'm in a conversation with a client who's in crisis might be the right move, because they can't help themselves, because they'll say too much, because they're not able to take guidance. Yeah, maybe you just want to lay the no comment line on them so that they don't hurt themselves even further. Mm-hmm. But in the vast majority of cases, establishing early control of the narrative and doing that in a way that feels non-personal is the trick.
Okay. So, and if you hear me typing, it's because I'm preparing. Your best quotes I'm going to turn into social media posts. So
awesome.
I'm sure you type fast too. I type as I think. So this helps me because, hey, time is like, you want to capture those moments. All right. So establishing early control of the narrative is so important. And oftentimes you do that by making sure that your viewpoint and perspective is in that very first story. Okay. So when you say in the book, you have 2 hours, talk to me about the nuances behind that. Because what I oftentimes we'll get the call after the first story's been written, or the second, third, fourth, fifth, right? And then I'm like, then it gets hard to contain. But how can leaders, whether you're a nonprofit or food client like you work with, food and beverage client, understand that it's that first story? You need to call your crisis communications people right when you get that first media inquiry, because that first story, it almost becomes the thing you have to defend. What's your take on that?
It sets the framework. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the trouble that most decision makers have in the first moments is that they want to get the information and they want everything to be right.
Yes.
And that's the problem. Is there's a difference between good and being right. What we want to do in our first move is be good. And the way to do that is through the statements that not only orient people or audiences to your value set, those things that you believe deeply in and their principles by which you operate. Those are fantastic things to be talking about in the first move, not about a particular incident. But you also want to stay in the present. We understand what's happening. We understand what's been said. We understand that this incident has occurred. And let me assure you, we are the ones who are most interested in resolving it favorably, for protecting this particular subject matter, XYZ. You know, you can, any way that you cut it, the first quotes do help set the frame. And you don't have to get too far out into the future. You don't have to have all the answers. You can simply say, we're here, we're on it, we're working this, and we won't rest until it's resolved. That's good. That's good. It's not right. It's not perfect, but it's good. And good is what we need.
That is awesome advice. Awesome advice. Hey, you should be a national correspondent on issues of crisis, because I think you give such great advice. One thing I tell clients, and I learned this when I worked for the mayor's office as press secretary. This I learned from my old boss. When the media calls, most people hit fight or flight mode. Okay. And there's a freeze mode in there too. So fight, I got to just, get all the information. And again, analysis paralysis. And then I wait too long. And then I fight, I get that really personal. It's very personal attack. Ego's leading the conversation there. Flight, who do they think they are? Why do I have to respond to them? I don't work for them, right? You love that one, right? We're busy. This is ridiculous. And then you have the freeze, which is just do nothing. And one thing that I learned that I use often is if a media person's looking for specific information, maybe it's a data-based number. I'm working with a couple of nursing home clients, and they're in the news right now, and they're not used to being in the news at all. And I've reported looking for vaccination rates. He's doing a statewide story on how staff not wanting to get vaccinated, staff in nursing homes. And it's not something you can force staff to do. So there's a very easy message point around that. But in particular, this nursing home I'm working with has a much lower rate than the average. And you can look at why, right? You can look at where they're located, what's the area like? Is it more conservative? All of that. But this reporter wanted information now, and, we'll get it to him soon, but we want to make sure he knows we're getting him the information. So we have to respond with something. So all you have to say is, I'm looking into this. Let me get right back to you. That's it. Yeah. And then it takes away that overwhelming pressure to figure out their response now. You have a little time. Of course, you want to make sure the reporter is not going to publish the story. And that's what we do. We understand their deadlines and work with them. So that first story, I think, one thing if there's any message I could get to, people that run anything that could be in the news, which is really everyone these days, given the digital pitchforks that exist, is, that first story is very important, right? The fight or flight mode, you have to, as you said, take yourself out of it and protect the brand. So the other thing I want to talk to you about is Let's talk a little bit about the kind of work you're doing with your clients now and how you're applying the principles of the book. So you're working mostly in the food and beverage industry, correct?
That's a big chunk of our portfolio. Yes.
And this is, so Hahn Public is the company, but you have other subsidiaries that sort of
Right.
feed into that, right? Okay. Hahn, Hahn Public, for those who want to know how it's spelled. Um, and and why did you decide to niche in food and beverage?
We really have two niches that we operate in. And then I've set up the company to where it looks like a goalpost. The first niche area or vertical is energy and environment. Climate change is an arena that is going to be the defining conversation of the next generation. And so as we think about the idea of crisis and really longer term, so you and I have talked before about issues management, which is it's sort of crisis communication, but stretched out over long periods of time. That energy and environment vertical is really important to me. I'll make the connection here in a second. The second vertical or post is food and beverage. And in between those two, connecting them, I have a digital business, digital marketing, also digital intelligence gathering, because this is the place where you have to create the tools necessary in order to predict what's going to happen before it happens. And that kind of forecasting capability can only be done with lots of data. So that's the way I've designed my business. And the reason those two have commonality, energy and environment, and food, is that they both exist at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy. They are essentials to life. And inside of that food business, by the way, we also include alcohol, which I put in the essentials to life category. Sometimes it can be a problem, but oftentimes you just need a beer.
Right. Are you a beer person?
I'm a beer person.
What kind?
Well, mostly lagers. This time of year, I'm enjoying the Mexican lagers more.
All right, that was an aside. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so that's how I've designed the business and the way I think about it. Those essentials for daily life. It's just to a great extent, it mirrors my own upbringing on the farm. That's the work we did. We fed people. The energy environment component of it is we keep people warm. And those are important to me. We don't do in our business, we don't do anything that has to do with luxury trips or sports or that's where cool people hang out. And I don't get invited to those parties anymore. Marathons was a really interesting exception. And it became a fascinating offshoot for crisis because in endurance racing, things go wrong, people die. And it becomes a microcosm of crisis communication in those moments. And so for whatever reason, I was always attracted to that. And that's how I made that one exception to the direction of my agency.
Mm-hmm. That's such an interesting, it feels like you run a very authentic agency in that you take on what you feel is, where your skill sets can be used and used in a way that really helps companies and that feels like authentic to you. And I think that's a challenge. I mean, it's just speaking business owner to business owner, that's a challenge that I've had personally. It's like, okay, when you first start an agency, the flashy big clients are exciting to you, right? Right.
Oh,
More
yes.
exciting, right? And then you kind of get a good dose of reality and you realize, here's what matters. The bottom line will always matter. That's how you run a business. And it's funny, the big flashy clients, sometimes their bottom line is no different than the client that is, the crisis shelter next door, from a output input standpoint. And then you get to think about what feels good, what clients feel good for your brand to service, and you start to find your own brand voice. It sounds like you've found it. And what I really like about what you do is having that digital intelligence is just having the data and having the analysis combined with the emotional aspect of communications. Not many firms have both.
It's a really interesting balancing act. What we have found, though, is that decision makers today are very reluctant to pull the trigger on any ideas without a ream of data to support that direction. And we can do that through our digital listening tools, the social listening tools. Also, there's just troves of data in places like YouGov. Data.world. They're just amazing data sources for that we can access now through our digital business. And it makes all the difference in the world when you can help people see the trajectory of an issue, where it's headed, and what are the possibilities. It's kind of like hurricane forecasting these days. You know how you have like 3 or 4 spaghetti lines?
Yeah, I like that.
You can feel that now in crisis work as well. And there's enough data to show you, well, it could be one of 3 or 4 directions.
We're living in an interesting time where corporate leaders are feeling that if they don't comment on highly political issues, they could lose some customers. So you saw with the Georgia election laws, you saw Coca-Cola, a CEO commenting, and I'm wondering your personal opinion on that. And it seems to me like these executives were doing digital listening and said, we have to say something, right? And what we say needs to be more about where public opinion's going, less maybe about my personal belief. What are your thoughts on that?
I think they forget their audience. They should, in fact, have a position on these important issues, but their audience is their employees, not the public. And so as you shape those,
but why? But I mean, if the consumer's buying their product, why it's not an audience?
Yeah, consumers, though, if you think about, let's just take Coke. When's the last time you bought a Coke product of any kind? Did you think about their position on Georgia voting laws?
No, but I think people are afraid of, and I don't have data to back this up, but they're afraid of the generation that's ahead of me, the 20-something-year-old that is, all about when they invest their parents' money, they're going to do responsible investing, ESG, that they're following the woke culture religiously on TikTok, and I better relate to them because they're my future. They're my current consumer and they're my future consumer.
Well, I won't disagree with that. I think that's a really important factor to weigh. The reason I would start with the internal audience, employees, is because they're your best brand ambassadors. There you have an army of evangelists for what the brand believes in and what it stands for. I like the idea of starting there. If you're going to come out with a particular stance on a public or political issue, imagine first the employee population and what it means to them. In Georgia voting laws, for example, I might have said that, the most important thing for my company, whether it's Coke or Home Depot or whoever, is that my employees feel like they have the opportunity to exercise their constitutional right to vote. And if there are barriers, how can I help reduce those barriers as an employer? Once I do that, now I have something to reflect to the outside.
Martin, you're communicating your values as you.
Exactly. Yeah. Instead of just joining the political fray, I'm going to live a value set and then reflect that out and allow it to speak versus having platitudes to deliver out into the ether.
Wow. I think a lot of corporations could have used your advice recently, right? Did you read the Wall Street Journal op-ed by Ted Cruz? I'll send it to you.
I have not seen that. No.
It was like maybe yesterday, 2 days ago. He said he's going to not take any more money from corporate PACs at all. And he took, I think, $3 million last cycle because of them responding what he felt to be blindly to the woke culture and ignoring facts. And it was interesting. I like to read both sides. And I know Ted's gotten into some trouble recently, so maybe he was more bold than he would have been 2 years ago. But
True. Yeah. And it goes to show that truth is a negotiated reality, isn't it? He's got his version of the truth, and the corporations are facing a different truth. Each of those truths has to be negotiated. Oftentimes it's done in the public space.
Yep, definitely. So, okay. So talk to me about, we have a little more time. I kind of want to dive into let's talk about the book. Now in your book, do you have, and I didn't get to read it yet because, by the way, I need a copy. You need to send me a copy.
Absolutely.
And I was going to get it on Amazon, but I don't think it's available yet on Amazon.
We're still in, I've got about 500 copies that I'm using for promotional giveaway purposes.
Okay.
After those are exhausted, then we'll go to Amazon. But I'm giving them out at no charge right now.
All right. Well, I'm going to email Holly.
Absolutely.
So what kind of, because, all of everything you say makes complete sense, but really selling this position in order to get people to listen and figure out how to break bad news. Tell us some stories about how you've helped some clients do this, or maybe how you've seen people do it wrong.
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit about what's right and wrong first, and then we can apply some examples to that. Inside the book, I create this model with the TikTok box around it. And really, it takes you down through these 5 steps as you negotiate through a challenging or crisis situation. These are the 5 steps. You have to activate your rapid response team. Number 1, you have to
you have to have one.
You have to have one. So there's the first answer to your question. If we were to pinpoint the one things brands do the worst when it comes to crisis, it's to activate a rapid response team. They're terrible at it. It's the CEO and the attorney. And now you've got yourself a real problem because you lost perspective.
All right, here's what we're going to do. And I'm sorry, I'm taking you off your thought. Let's talk about the legal attorney stuff, because that's such we can't gloss over that. In the university client I mentioned, I was on Zoom with the attorney and the head of the university and the head of the board. And I was the only female. And I was going toe to toe with him on what we have to do. And I was not able to sway how I wanted to. How have you seen success in being on the collaborative spectrum with these attorneys? Sometimes you can't be, sometimes you can be.
Great question. And I think the way I have succeeded in that is by acknowledging there are 2 courts. There's a court of law that the attorney has to be thinking about and provide guidance in the context of what will be in the future, a court of law conversation. The second court is the court of public opinion. And this is your domain. This is where you're the expert. Mm-hmm. Court of public opinion has different rules and certainly a very different timer on it. The success I've had working with attorneys is by acknowledging at the table with the decision makers, hey, attorney is arguing in a court of law reference, and they're trained to be contentious, right? They're trained to argue and reduce risk. In court of a public opinion, we're trained in a completely different way, and that is to control the narrative by proper and authentic means. Ethical and authentic means. But controlling the narrative might mean that in the early moments of a particular situation, that you have to accept some responsibility. Classic example, I was reading in Washington Post this morning that a freshman at Bowling Green University died from a hazing incident where alcohol poisoning involved. This hazing incident was, it's been played out tragically dozens and hundreds of times. But here we go. We're going to a fraternity hazing party. The incoming pledges are, quote unquote, forced to drink large volumes of alcohol, pass out, they take them home, and they end up in the hospital and die from alcohol poisoning. Bowling Green University wasn't even present in that article. Nothing on the university side of this. And it may be that you would say, hey, that's a win for Bowling Green. I would say missed opportunity. The missed opportunity in the court of public opinion is, let me tell you Bowling Green's position on hazing. Absolutely forbidden. No tolerance. What came out of that, though, was the parents of the deceased saying universities should have policies against hazing, implying that Bowling Green didn't.
Yeah.
Missed opportunity. Court of public opinion versus court of law.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I guarantee you the decision makers there were, okay, someone died.
Clamp down.
We're going into a suit. Everyone clamp down. Where, come on. And the court of law is, are you really going to be damaged by a statement that communicates, your distress about the situation, your current policy, and, that pays respect to the victim and the victim's family and friends? No, you're not
at all. Man, I tell you what, one of the most challenging cases that I've ever been involved in was with a natural gas client. They distribute natural gas to homes. Well, a particular home on a particular morning, this is more than 10 years ago, there was a leak in the area, a leak in the home. A gentleman who owned that home turns on the lights at 6 a.m. His house blows to the moon. He's dead. And the attorneys immediately put a gag order on everyone involved. And one of the best examples of the work we do came from the head of corporate communications. He and I were on the call before the attorneys came in. And he said to me, Jeff, how much more of a check are we going to have to write if we admit that this is a tragedy, that we're suffering as a provider of natural gas? We're absolutely heartbroken that this happened. How much bigger is the check going to be? And I said to him, I think it'll be less. He says, bingo. In fact, that one conversation swayed the entire swung the pendulum back to a much more human, a much more empathetic response on the part of the corporation. Yes. It's still a tragedy. It happened. You can't unring that bell. The toothpaste is out of the tube, however you want to say it. Right. But it created, at least in the court of public opinion, an empathetic orientation towards the brand. Wow, brilliant stroke of genius, and the perfect way to say it. How much more is the check going to be? And right then and there, he took the high ground away from the attorneys.
I love it. I think I'm going to, I'm making a note of that. Hopefully I don't have to use that one day, but because that's something that gets into, because, I'm not a lawyer and I don't think you are either. So,
nope.
But I also have common sense. And I'm like, okay, how is this really going to change, the case? All right. So great advice on how to deal with lawyers. And on that, I just want to talk quickly about universities, and sort of get your take on why most universities are so horrible at crisis communications.
The short answer is because they don't do it very often. It is a practice skill, and their mentality is to gather all information. I mean, every scintilla of facts and figures and information and context before they make any kind of statement. That is an academically trained mindset. They don't do crisis communication. That's why they're so bad at it. And their willingness or unwillingness to practice the craft determines who, in fact, navigates situations successfully and who doesn't. And it's as simple as that. If a brand and a rapid response team refuse to practice this very unique and weird craft of crisis communication, they're not going to be any good at it. So having drills, tabletop exercises periodically, twice a year for the best clients that I serve, they're really quite good at responding in an appropriate fashion and time frame.
Yep. And okay, so do you see commonalities between brands? And this brands is broad. It could be universities, could be corporations, could be
Sure.
nonprofit.
Yeah, exactly.
Those who, if they have a good crisis communications system set up in order to respond quickly and effectively, do you also see that they are also better at proactive communications too? Is it those who invest in proactive are also willing to invest in crisis, or do you not see that? Because in my experience, what I've seen recently with some university clients is they typically don't have either acts together.
I think you make a really good point, and I hadn't really thought about the correlation, but they're not good at communications in general, likely because they're afraid of negative fallout or crisis situations. And so the safest course is often to not communicate about anything. So I suspect you're right. I'll bet there is a correlation that's pretty high amongst those who actively communicate, work themselves and work issues in and amongst their publics and stakeholders pretty well, and their ability to manage crises. I think you're onto something there.
Maybe we'll look at some data there. We'll do a little data project, right?
Right.
Okay, number one is activate active response. We have 5 steps to break bad news. How to do it, right? Yep. Number one, activate your active response team. Hey, brands, you have to have one and you have to invest in it. And this is what drives me crazy. Nobody wants to invest until after the crisis. And I mean, how I'm getting off on a tangent. How do you convince brands to invest? I mean, are you able to sign clients after you've worked on a crisis? But how often do they want to do it before the crisis?
Yeah, it's unfortunately rare. It's hard. There is a really interesting, and I'm making a quick aside in the book about it. This is called the Cassandra effect, and it is around the psychology of warnings. The Cassandra was a prophetess in ancient Greek. She foretold of the Trojan horse coming in and the Greeks beating the Trojans. She warned everybody. No one listened to her. Why? Well, there's really interesting attributes to the Cassandra effect that explain that. But one of the things that we have to do as crisis communicators is pay attention to that psychology of warnings, because oftentimes when we talk about crisis, they're too far away. They are possibilities, not probabilities. Oftentimes, we're not the experts either. You need expertise to help warn clients. Hey, you've got an issue. It's not a matter of if, but when that's going to come on you. And so we've got to pay more attention about making the case for crisis communication proactivity by making the probabilities of potential issues more real, and doing a really good job of benchmarking. Like, let's just take universities. Everything bad that can possibly happen to a brand happens at a university. Kids, you have fatalities amongst teenagers. Bowling Green is a great example right now. You have crime, you have cheating scandals, you have rogue faculty, you have all of the white supremacy coming onto these open campuses and holding protests and inflaming student groups. You've got every issue that's in society gets concentrated down into a campus. And so they're amongst the most vulnerable, in my opinion, about what can go wrong and what they're going to be needing to talk about. So with universities, you've got to create almost a library to show your clients, hey, here's what's happening at Bowling Green today. Here's what happened at University of Texas yesterday. Here's what happened at North Dakota State 3 weeks ago. This cumulative library of information really helps make it real that these are probabilities, not possibilities.
Very good. Very good. Yes. And even then, slow tortoise. Right?
Absolutely. Well, interestingly enough, I was in front of a room of decision makers and talking about the probabilities of particular issues affecting that brand. Mm-hmm. This was now, probably 25 years ago. And I remember very clearly the general counsel sitting at the table saying, I I want none of this conversation to continue. I want no documentation that we ever had this discussion. Anybody with any notes needs to give them to me right now. There will be no record that we even thought about this and knew that it was possible.
What are you referring to? Thinking, like, what were you thinking about?
Well, in this particular company's case, they handled a lot of hazardous materials. And so there's not only the emissions of those, but catastrophic release, the probabilities of those release, how many people on the neighborhood fence lines would die as a result, et cetera. And the general counsel wanted no record of any kind of risk management conversation to take place because it demonstrated a knowledge or foreknowledge of potential liability. That's how tough it is to sometimes crack the code on these dug in types of mentalities. Yeah.
And I think we could have an entire another podcast episode around the issue advocacy situation and how brands respond to calls to be more woke, right?
Brands
don't know how to respond to it. Universities are getting these questions too. Where's your Black leadership? And, you know, gosh forbid if you're branded as a racist corporation on social media and the digital pitchforks come out. And there's so much there. I don't have all the answers for it, but let's get through this. So activate active response team is number one. Okay. Have to have one. Okay. What's number two?
Issue a holding statement. We understand the issue is happening. This incident has occurred. We're on it. We're working it. It's less than 100 words, and it needs to be put out in the first 15 minutes of rapid response team activation. What did we say when we say use a holding statement? We're here. We're working it. We didn't admit anything. There's no liability.
What you're communicating, these things, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what you're helping, especially news media, understand is that there is a voice that is prepared to speak. We will control this narrative. Mm-hmm. And then after that, it's the 3 M's: message, messenger, and then the method of delivery.
That's done.
What's your message? Who's your messenger? Oftentimes we default to CEOs or presidents of universities. Bad idea in many cases. Why do that?
Right. Just because, well, okay, there's schools of thought on that. And I would like to hear. So message, I mean, you know, okay. So when the problem I see with number 3, message, is maybe this is just me, but you need, I know you have a couple minutes. You need to have somebody that's going to sign off on this and do it fast. Okay. And if you have to be fast, I like the idea of a Jeff Hahn or Joanna Doven crafting it fast. We're the crafters, and then we get approval from whatever.
The decision maker, yeah.
Right. Is that what you suggest too? Because if you have, first of all, you need to have the expert craft the holding statement. You can't have the CEO do it.
Correct. Okay. Yep. We are the crafters of message, and there's a particular way to do that. The frame or the phrase that I use often is the employment of strategic ambiguity. Don't say too much. Just say enough to establish control.
Love it.
Then with message, you have all kinds of options. There's 16 different options that I detail in the book, including the withholding of apology. Be really careful about apologies. Oftentimes people think that's the first thing that needs to happen. It may in fact be a thing that needs to happen, but I would say it's the last option in your toolkit from a message standpoint.
Why do you say that?
Well, apology can in fact indicate liability. So you don't want to use it as an automatic default. You have a number of other tools at your disposal. So my encouragement simply is, it may be that we're going to issue an apology, but let's walk through your other options first.
Got it. Is there an option that sticks out to you as being the most commonly valid option?
Yep. It's the scapegoat option.
Tell me about it.
In scapegoating, we blame anybody or anything else, including my favorite scapegoat of all time is circumstance. mean, think about the Volkswagen emissions scandal.
Oh, that was a good one.
The company ultimately chose a scapegoating message. It was, quote, a group of rogue engineers making decisions outside of the value set of the company. So they scapegoated that, and that allowed the brand to live on. And Volkswagen as a brand is still quite viable. They're still in business. And
I love, if anyone hasn't seen their sort of, I think it was last year's or 2 years ago, the Super Bowl, their sort of coming out commercial.
Yes.
It was in the dark. It's like, it was like from the darkness, we saw the light. I thought that was great. That was a great way to come out. Love it. Okay. So Messenger. So, okay, maybe this is my background as press secretary, where obviously I would have to go on camera.
Yep.
But ultimately the public wants to hear from the leader, the mayor, right?
And you said the right word, ultimately, but not first. First is your trained spokesperson. Second, it might be a subject matter expert. And the XY graph on this is it could be a technical expert, a subject matter expert on a peculiar thing, a technical capability, or it might be an expert that has more orientation towards things like ethics. So experts are your second line.
Are you saying a lawyer should be the messenger sometimes?
Possibly. But not the first one, maybe the second one. Mm-hmm. Then we'll pull in CEO or president.
When do you do that? When you think you have everything gathered and you have the strategy ready, how we're going to get through this.
Yeah. And typically it's when you feel that either the character of the brand or the competency of the brand is being sufficiently challenged. Character and competency are the two grading scales that you use. And once those are sufficiently questioned, that's when you need a higher level spokesperson.
So what I find is, and I know that you've worked on more large scale crises than me. So this is why I feel like I'm going to school a little bit here. But what I find is, and not in all cases, and maybe this is more with local media, that if the leader of the organization isn't the one speaking, the pitchforks start to get raised. Where's the president on this? Why isn't he here? Why isn't he speaking? And then you're on double defense. What's your perspective on that? But then again, the other angle of that is if it's a very large scale crisis where there's national news media, the reality is they just want someone. They want somebody to give them something.
Yeah. In fact, what the president or CEO, he or she can do is establish presence. I have appointed this person to do this person to do that, this person to do other things, and let those experts then take the center stage. Be CEO-ish, delegate those responsibilities. Don't become spokesperson.
Got it. Okay. Then we could get into that more because, what if the corporation doesn't have a strong spokesperson?
Oh yeah.
And then, I don't know if you've been in a situation where your client's like, hey, Joanna, hey, Jeff, we want you to give this interview. And I'm like, that looks horrible. Have you done it?
I have done it. Only as a last resort, because it would have been worse for the client for them to be present, to be the spokespeople.
Right. I hear you. Okay. So I know you have a minute. Method of delivery. So this is sort of, are we doing it an email statement, a phone interview, or are we doing a press conference? Talk to me about that.
Yeah. In fact, think about a bad situation, and here's the default. We need the CEO to go in front of a press conference to apologize. The 3 worst ideas ever in crisis communication. Now, they are options, but again, in method of delivery, I think about, here's your options. And by the way, one of the most interesting options these days is do your own press work. A brand can set up a camera and interview a spokesperson and send that video out on social channels and the amplification channels just as easy as the press can.
And I think that's something that's more acceptable today since coronavirus.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then you can edit that video. You can do take twos. You can do a lot of controlling activity there. And you can provide that to amplification outlets, media. They'll use it because you're not going to give them anything else.
And, I think that there might be, and maybe this is me, I don't know. Could there be situations where you have such a rock star CEO that you want them to nip it in the bud right away with a press conference?
Sure. The nice part about the tools in Breaking Bad News is they're all about providing options. And you might have a situation where all of those things are true. I got a great CEO. We've got a great story. Let's get the press around right now and hammer this out. Mm-hmm. And you'll do that because you have a sense that we can get this out of the news cycle in the next 24 hours because we've got the right guy, the right spokesperson, the right story. And if we broadcast this out to its maximum, people will move on. And that's the stratagem that you would use if you had all of those assets lined up.
Love it. Love it. Well, I know we are out of time, and I want to just encourage everyone to check out your website, which is breakingbadnews.com.
Breakingbadnewsbook.com.
Breakingbadnewsbook.com, and soon to be available widely on Amazon and perhaps other places too. Yeah. And I love your quantitative approach to what many people think is very qualitative, and that is responding during a crisis. You have to blend the emotional and the human aspect with data, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's really my orientation. Crisis communication is a system, not a dark art. Anybody can learn the system.
Love it. Well, I'm going to be sharing this far and wide and encouraging people to learn this system. So we will talk again soon. I'd love to have you back on, and maybe we'll talk about the woke culture next time.
Sounds great, Joanna. Yeah, enjoyed being here.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Take care.
See you.